Welcome back to another episode of the Frustrated CEO podcast. My name is Patrick Lyons. I'm one of the co-hosts of this thing that you're listening to, and I'm joined by two of my friends and colleagues of almost a decade now. I can't believe it's been that long. Patsy Freeman and Leb Tannenbaum. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Good to have you both back. It's been a couple of weeks since we've been in the studio, but we're excited about today because today's episode, we're going to tackle the topic of strategic communications and its role in helping to alleviate your frustrations, our CEOs and senior listeners who are tuning in today. To do that, we've engaged the help of PR strategist and strategic communication expert and thought leader, Monique Farmer. Now, Monique, APR, runs a PR communication consultancy called Avant Solutions, and is the creator of Anvil Ready, which is an online communication strategy builder that aids the communication professional in creating communication plans. Monique also teaches at the University of Texas at Austin. She previously served as the director of communications for Nebraska's largest school district and in corporate communications for ConAgra Foods, now ConAgra Brands. Also spent some time in a number of government roles. So Monique Farmer, welcome to the Frustrated CEO podcast.
Good evening, Patrick. Thank you so much for inviting me. And good evening, Patsy and Leb. I'm glad you're joining us.
Thank you.
So glad to have you. Let's start right out of the gate. I was thinking about, as we were preparing for today, maybe the assumption is that every listener understands what we mean by strategic communications, but perhaps not. So maybe a good place to start, Monique, as the expert. This is your field, not ours. How would you describe the difference between communication and strategic communication? What's the difference, and why does a CEO need to know it?
It's such a great question, Patrick. And so I would begin to describe that by emphasizing how important research is before we begin any communication journey. I would also extend that thought to before we begin any business. I think many business owners have a passion for what they bring to the table. They have their technical competency. And then we get into this whole world of leading a small firm, a small to medium-sized firm, especially if you're a first-time or first-generation entrepreneur and haven't necessarily dived into the research enough in terms of understanding what the market demand is for a particular area of service or goods, understanding who the competition is, what their strengths are, and then what you bring to the table in terms of a niche. So it's very similar in the communication world, where if you want to put together good communication strategy, you always want to start with research. And when we think about across an organization, you have that two-prong approach. So first and foremost, as a business owner or as a CEO, whether you're leading a large Fortune 500 company or a very small for-profit that's privately run, maybe has an advisory board, you have a two-prong approach to think about, because you have to conduct communication internally across those people who make your organization go, whether that's just you and a handful of people or 50 people, 100 people. You've got to get all those people aligned. So you've got to do that for your organization inside. You've got to market yourself to external audiences. But then if you're like me and it is your business, or if you aren't necessarily running a PR communication firm, but you're running, say, Nike, you still have to translate that story into something that resonates with potential customers so that they believe in what you do and what you deliver, because it can't just be about commercialism, especially now when we start talking about what millennials expect to see, what Gen Y expects to see out of organizations in terms of what do you give back. So you really want to strategically think about the research and how you leverage the story in that research, the data, your insights, to put together a proactive strategy that delivers.
Well, it sounds so clear and direct, yet I must admit that I can already think of 4 or 5 organizations that either don't do or only partially do what you're talking about. And how people within the organization, especially, are confused about what their role is and what they're supposed to be doing. So that must really amp up the frustration of a CEO. How do you support, or how do you talk to a CEO about the value of doing what you just described?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because I do have a number of CEOs who are clients to Avant Solutions. And I'm also a university professor and a coach and mentor at heart. My name, which I learned about 5 years ago, Monique, actually literally means advisor. And so I'm often in this role where you teach, you reteach, you remind. And so even though you've gone through, potentially, I have a client who recently we went through all of their research needs to create their brand update. Their brand hadn't been refreshed in more than 30 years, and it showed. And so we did all of the research, and we had a new visual identity. We put together that brand story, the promise, all of the essence factors that go into branding. And I got this client teed up to do some pieces of the soft brand launch in local community. And the brand elements that were put together for the use of starting to show this new brand look and feel as part of the rest of the pieces, and it was on a generic PowerPoint slide presentation. And so I have to remind myself, even in my own frustration, it's kind of like, well, what did we do all of that work for? To remind clients, and this is not the first client. I mean, I've had clients who are similar, sometimes even at the board level, where it's like we've spent probably a year going through some rebrand elements, and then a board member will say something off the wall like, well, I don't really like that shade of blue. We should just change that.
Yeah.
Like, that has a whole psychological rationale for why it's that way. We went through like however many focus groups. And so it's constantly being patient and just reminding and teaching and reteaching. I mean, I feel like in a lot of ways, depending on the organization, sometimes we're introducing this for the first time to organizations who have no idea what we're talking about. I remember when we went through rebranding, when I led the communication strategy work at the school district, the largest school district in the state of Nebraska. And we actually got requests from research firms to understand this whole science around what is this branding a school district? Like, how, where's that coming from? How do you do it? They wanted to learn like the steps we took, the phases we organized the work into. But I remember being on a road show to get buy-in at the onset of that work before we launched. And I remember literally standing in front of an auditorium full of school principals, about 90 of them, who were looking at me like I had 3 eyeballs. And I'm sure they thought it was the dumbest thing they had ever heard. But we got them across the finish line. And now when I drive across the city and I see billboards, I'm proud that we created a system that sustained itself. And this is 5 years later now, maybe longer than that. I think we got on that journey about 2017 back then. So it's been like about 6 years. But they eventually learned what it was we were trying to teach them about the equity and branding, about your storytelling and why that's important, about organizational pride. It's a journey. It's certainly a journey, and it's educating across a workforce from the inside out. And branding is just one piece of overarching strategic communication, planning, and implementation.
Monique, you're currently CEO of Avant Solutions, and you spent enough time either supporting CEO clients or working in organizations proper. This is the Frustrated CEO podcast. So we know that I want to tap into your experience as a CEO and supporting CEOs. Talking to an audience of frustrated CEOs, a lot of times frustration permeates my communication. What are some patterns or qualities that you've seen in successful CEOs who have been able to channel that frustration into positive communication?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. What patterns have I seen in successful CEOs? I think about some of the leaders I consider some of the best ones I've ever worked for. And to be truly honest, Patrick, some of that is just innate in
Mm,
terms of I've had leaders I can remember, one in particular who I would put together her presentation for, she might have needed to be in an audience full of 200 people, but her schedule was so back to back that we maybe only had 20 minutes before it was time for her to go on live in front of this audience, and I would brief her, and she just had a great memory. She hadn't created her presentation. It was just like, this is what it is. This is who's out there. This is what we need to hit. And she would knock it out of the park. So I think some of it's innate, great memories. I think the ability to have empathy at a level that means you understand what your audience needs to get from what you're relaying. I think some of the best ones are just natural storytellers and just
mm,
easy to listen to. They believe in what they're saying, which just really adds a layer and level of authenticity that sometimes can be taught and sometimes can't.
mm,
But also, again, they understand what they need to leave with the audience. They understand who the audience is. While they may be standing in front of a group of 200 people, there may be only one or two specific audiences they need to keep in mind that they need to deliver to.
mm,
Mm.
So that's often something that we teach as well, especially if I'm teaching someone who may need to present in front of a board and we're proactively anticipating the questions we might get about a particular issue or topic. I'm teaching them to think about whose question is that really? And what are they really after? And how do we need to respond to that?
mm. That's a great answer.
It really is.
Thank you.
Monique, when I was twice, I've left consulting and gone inside, once in a pretty large organization. And the first time I presented to a board, I was nervous.
It's nerve-wracking. Yeah.
Do you have anything to say about overcoming your nervousness in tight situations when you need to deliver a strategic communication?
Absolutely. The first thing is don't wait until you get in front of the board and you're nervous. Like even before tonight, I have like a little ritual that I do to get that nervousness out. And I do my Wonder Woman pose so that I can build up my energy about how powerful I am to justify. I do it, as cheesy as it sounds. I do deep breathing so that I can really like push out that nervous energy before, especially in particularly, I used to do quite a good number of on-camera television interviews with little to almost no notice on very difficult topics, particularly when I worked for the federal government and at the school district. And so, I mean, this is literally like, I mean, my day could be 1 o'clock and I might get a phone call about a TV camera being downstairs in the lobby. And that, I didn't maybe knew they were coming or maybe didn't. But I was the authorized spokesperson for my organization. And so I'd get ready and go down there and do the interview. So there was a lot of deep breathing, practicing, a lot of just getting very familiar with high level organizational messages that I needed to know at any given time and could spit out, and a lot of positive self-talk. I try to, even to this day, take advantage of some of the breaks that I have in my day. I like to go for like short walks just to have a steady countenance that is just naturally unnervous and that helps other people feel comfortable. I feel like I intentionally do things to be cognizant of that on a daily basis. So I just think daily rituals, practices can help you like get your regular nervousness out anyway. 5 minutes of meditation. I love Headspace on Netflix. That's one of my favorites. But you don't need a whole lot of time, I don't think. I think you just need a regular practice of training your brain waves so that you just have a natural countenance. But if I'm super nervous, there's definitely going to be some Wonder Woman posing happening.
I
read that a number of years ago. I I like to think of it more as a Superman pose for myself than a Wonder Woman pose. But, that's okay. But there is something about opening your body, right? Opening it up, body language, breathing, feeling powerful, and then walking out on stage. And I have worked, to your point, where it sounds cheesy. So when I'm presenting to an audience, if I'm going to do that, I'll try to find maybe a little bit more secluded place. But there is something about doing that and then walking out in front of the crowd and feeling like I've got this, right? As opposed to curling up in a ball and just worrying and the anxiety. It's a great simple strategy, but it's a really good suggestion. I had forgotten that. So thank you.
Well, what do they say? 90% of communication, over 90% is nonverbal. So if you're not doing that, you're only operating on 10% of your resources.
Why would you do that, right? Like,
exactly. Why would you do that?
So let me ask this again, back to that CEO frustration, the frustrated audience. How can a CEO convey their frustration in a way that is received, in a way that doesn't spin people up, create chaos in the organization, but in a way that is effective? It effectively communicates the issue without causing collateral damage.
I think it's important for leaders to understand that their tenor and how they approach things impacts everybody and everything. And so I think it's important to have a personality that is self-controlled. I think it is very possible to convey frustration with firmness, with passion, and with a level of intensity that is still respectful of the recipient. Now, I say that purely cognizant of the fact that I have 3 children. One is now an adult. He's 21. I have a 21, a 17-year-old, and a 14-year-old. And Patrick, I tell you, I could be very firmly speaking in this voice about something that I expect to have done or delivered, and then being told that I'm yelling at said 14-year-old. Like, I haven't raised my voice at all, but I do mean firmly what it is that I'm trying to convey. So I think it's important for us as leaders to have a level of self-control that is consistently respectful of a recipient, even when we have to deliver news or have conversations that are difficult, especially in particular if we're going to be in today's day and age in front of an audience. Lord forbid we get recorded saying something that's out of pocket or being in some kind of tone that is considered less than respectful. No time better than now to have that go viral. And we've seen that. I remember I was going to bring into my classroom the case study from the CEO at Away, who was accused of being very nasty behind the scenes by her leadership team and some of her workforce. We also heard that same case study with Ellen DeGeneres, and she went on live television to apologize. So I don't think it behooves us as leaders to not have a dial on the manner by which we control ourselves. Now, that said, I mean, I've certainly been frustrated at times. It's so funny to me now because people who have worked for me in other roles that I had, now that we have carried on a friendship beyond those roles, I'll talk about like some of the war stories behind the scenes, and they'll say stuff like, I had no idea that was going on. Like, you kept us so shielded from that. And I've certainly had times where I've closed my door so no one can hear me call people who I probably wouldn't be proud of the tone that I used with some of them. But I do think that it's important for us to self-regulate that.
That's great. If we go back to the audience for a minute, audiences, especially generationally and from a diversity and equity and inclusion perspective, really maybe vary, or the impact of the communication lands differently with different people. I mean, that's true always, but do you have any advice, any thoughts on understanding your audience maybe in a more sophisticated way than you may have approached audiences before? And I'm also thinking specifically, Monique, of the older CEOs that we have worked with, who as an example, have stories that are no longer relevant or maybe even offensive, or jokes that were funny, in the 60s and 70s, and they're not funny anymore.
They weren't funny then. There's somebody to put people on check. That's a great question. So this is what I would offer to that. This is what I would lend to that, because Lev, I think you bring up such an important point that you may or may not realize you're bringing up. And I think that is the power and the strength in the diversity of teams and who makes up your team. Because if we're focus group testing messaging before it leaves our organizations, we're potentially, and not only focus group testing, but listening to the feedback, especially and particularly the feedback that we get from people internal to the organization who belong to those populations. It's not scientific research, but it's valid and we should take it into account. I'll give another recent example of I got a screenshot from one of my friends that I've known since freshman year in college, and it was about Juneteenth at Target. I don't know if any of you all saw it, but the only thing that was served at their Juneteenth celebration was watermelon. And it kind of got blamed on the intern, but I didn't get the impression that there was any person of color on the planning team for that. And so people probably unintentionally and quite frankly, innocently, but ignorantly committed an offense against people and really offended their workforce. And you don't just offend people of color, you offend people across the entire workforce who understand the importance of respectfully valuing all cultures and all people. And so we put ourselves in a really good space when we populate our teams diversely and we actually listen to the recommendations that are coming from the people who also have the company's best interests at heart. And why wouldn't they? That's where their paycheck is coming from.
Thank you. That's a great answer.
And as we diversify our teams, and not only in a variety of ways, so we've kind of gone holistic. I mean, multidimensional with diversification these days. What suggestions, or how do you see that we've talked about listening, but how do CEOs have to start listening either differently or expanded or?
That is a great, great question. I had a conversation with a leader maybe about a month ago, and it was with regard to a reputational issue that was happening inside of an organization. And me having the perspective as a Black woman, I feel like I was trying to explain that perspective that other people inside of the organization likely had with regard to this particular issue. And I really felt like it was falling on deaf ears.
Oh.
Are you all still there? I'm sorry, my internet froze.
That's okay. Yeah, we can end it. Yep. So you said
it ended on deaf ears.
Yep.
Yeah, and I don't feel like it was intentional. And this is a person that I really like. This person is very, comes across as very open, very progressive with regard to their thinking. I might venture as far to say, I get the impression the person is liberal, but I didn't get the impression that what I was trying to relay to the person with regard to trying to articulate someone else's perspective and experience and why they were so upset. I just don't feel like that was really being internalized. I felt like it was being dismissed. And again, I don't think it was malicious. I'm not really sure. It was almost like there was just this fence up and there was just no way to get through it. So I'm not really sure. I think that leaders have to be open to perspectives that aren't their own. I think it behooves us all to stop looking at the things that make us different and try to find common ground on the things that there are so many things that make us all very much alike. We all want to make good livings. If we have children, we want them to go to good schools. We want them to have good access to be whoever they decide they want to be and how they want to contribute to their Earth's journey. I think we have so many more things that make us alike than different. And if we try to focus on those and we're more open to understanding one another, then maybe we can truly hear.
Amen.
Mm-hmm.
That was like mic drop moment. That was cool.
Mhm.
Monique, we talk a lot about the importance of strategic alignment at the top, meaning, if you're hoping to get an organization pulling in the same direction, you darn well better have your leadership team aligned, not always necessarily agreeing, but aligned.
Yeah.
As a strategic communications expert, what we know, we encounter this. Alignment requires communication. It requires navigating into conflict. So as a strategic communications expert, somebody you've got CEOs as clients, you've been inside organizations, what gets in the way? If I'm a CEO and I need alignment in my organization, we would all agree you do. What gets in the way from a communications aspect of my team's ability to align?
I think that's Drecker. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Because if you don't have the culture or you're not creating or building the culture, it's going to be really difficult to get that alignment. You have to start with culture. I mean, we see so many brands too that on the outside, you see them on the outside and there may be a brand perception externally. You go work inside and it's like, whoa, this doesn't match. This doesn't match at all because there's a story being told to the external audience that isn't lived on the inside of that organization. And that's a problem because then that also potentially spells a culture issue.
Mhm.
And the other one that I will bring up, dare I say it, is some leadership teams are on a chessboard. And what I mean by that is you sometimes have people on personal individual agendas.
Yeah.
And so I think that it also behooves organizations to think about if they're hiring people and right seating them, if they're vetting them well enough on the front end to make sure they're the right culture fit. Definitely the leadership team included, that you're placing people in seats whose values align with the organizational values. It's so important. Otherwise, you potentially run the risk of not creating the culture you want, or even worse, having a toxic one that can't be fixed. Because
Right.
everything starts at the top. Culture starts at the top. I like to give this very simplistic example of culture, even in my own household. Again, my 3 children. I'd made a comment to my son the other day because my daughter found a cup in his bedroom, and that's a no-go culturally in our house. You don't take food to the bedroom. And I'm like, you've only lived here for 14 years. You know, if they walk in the door, there's shoes all around the door. We don't walk on carpet with our shoes on in this house. Does that mean they don't sneak and do it? Of course they do. If I'm not home or I've seen them on the way out in the morning, but they know that that is not part of the house culture. But it's these things that you design, these norms, these cues that create a culture, and people have to believe them and live them out. When I worked for a food company, I particularly remember visiting a food plant that had such stringent food safety culture. They had such a stringent food safety culture that I walked on the floor as a communication person. I was there to meet with the plant manager. But I walked on the food plant floor and, it's so loud in there and everybody has what are those things called? Ear plugs?
Protectors, yeah.
Ear protectors, yes. Or there's plugs or the whole big thing.
Yeah.
But they were all like, none of us could hear each other. And they were all doing this, like pointing to their heads because I didn't have the hairnet on. And it's like, we don't do that here. What are you doing? You shouldn't be on the floor. So I was like, I gotta get out of here and go put on a hairnet. But culture is something that we intentionally create and build. And in order to roll out strategic communication across an organization, I mean, you also do it to create culture. You're working hand in hand with that HR team when you're intentionally after something to help every person in that organization understand who they are, why they're there, what they do for that makes the company go.
I have a question about humor. Some people are very naturally able to tell a good joke at the right time. I always forget the punchline. So I have to really work on it. But I think like storytelling, the right story at the right time can really be helpful. Do you teach like leaders about using humor?
In a way, I mostly try to read them to understand where their strengths are. I
Mhm.
don't necessarily write in jokes into remarks if I'm writing remarks or if somebody on my team is. But I will tell you, I once got to meet Ted Sorensen. We all know who Ted Sorensen is,
Mhm.
JFK speechwriter. And I remember he taught us this formula that I use to this day. If I'm the speechwriter or the remarks writer, I don't get to do as much of that anymore, but it's fun and I like it when I do get to do it, because you really have to get into understanding that person and their voice and how they would talk about something, the words they use. There's a whole science to it. Writing for the ear, there's a science to that. But his formula was, right, speech writing is really just a matter of a few lines. The headline, that's what the speech is going to be about, the central theme. The top line, that's like the most important information that you need to relay to the audience. The bottom line, the key takeaways they need to have after they've heard your speech, and some funny lines. And so I don't know how Ted got to a place where he helped JFK put that formula together and deliver it perfectly when he needed to. But I do think there's something to be said about having that as an innate trait also, reading your audience and understanding what they might find funny or not. I am certainly always pleased when my own humor lands in a way that I get guffaw across an audience and auditorium. Sometimes I'm surprised, like, oh, I didn't realize that was funny. That's funny. Okay, good. That's funny. I just think it just depends.
Monique, you've been you've been doing this for a couple of decades. A lot of your experience, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of your experience has been in that emergency response, right? So something happens and we need a team to respond. And you alluded earlier, a lot of times you were on camera or you were in front of the microphone. What advice do you have from that experience? What advice do you have for a CEO who perhaps isn't prepared for crisis response, or is in the middle of a crisis response? Sometimes when you're in the middle of it, that's the wrong time to create the plan, I think, but I don't know. Talk to the audience.
If you're not prepared, get prepared. That would be my advice. You can always anticipate the potential vulnerabilities you have as a leader, as an organization. So why wait until they come to you? Also, make a friend before you need a friend. In the media, across the most important organizations that you may need to have your back or work with in the event of any of those scenarios materializing on you. In terms of on camera, my advice for leaders would be to remember that you're not speaking to the reporter, you're speaking to the audience. So for instance, if you've got a regional flood, we managed that for Corps of Engineers in 2011. I led that media relations team. And we understood clearly that we were speaking to people whose farmland was flooded, who lost their homes, or who had to evacuate and couldn't come back to their homes for weeks at a time, or who had to depend on the federal government for the recovery and the aftermath. Whenever I'm training somebody who's at school district that might have to get on camera, I remind them that your audience is likely a mother who's sitting at home watching the 9 o'clock news. It's not that TV reporter who's in front of you. And so how do we need to speak to her? We need to match the tone for the topic that we're covering. And we need to have a conversation that she understands the empathy that you're relaying, or if the issue is something that wasn't handled properly, that it's relayed, it will get taken care of, and the corrective actions that will unfold as a result in the aftermath of that situation.
It's a media response.
Yeah.
Very good.
There's a lot more to go. So one thing, I guess, and maybe I'm tying it to the Wonder Woman, Superman piece, or the breathing and meditation piece. But when I was spending a couple of years with New York City Transit in the Department of Subways, there would be things happen that were fit this emergency context. Some of them were tragic.
Yeah.
And the person who led the department at that time, I thought did a really good job of maintaining. And there was the hurricane that hit, that flooded everything. Of kind of, I guess, maybe grace under pressure.
Oh yeah.
Right. Some form of don't show that you're frantic. Is that or that the emergency is still unfolding? And is it okay to say we don't know yet, or I don't have enough to comment? I don't have enough information to comment on that yet. So I'm just trying to flush out a little bit more, because we're getting used to emergencies, right? We're getting
Yeah.
used to fires and storms and people losing their homes and all kinds of things.
Yeah, I hear a couple things in your question. First, the first part of your question had to do with, again, maintaining your composure, which is incredibly important. It doesn't help anybody, especially if you're the person who's heading up crisis management or crisis communication, and they're different.
Okay.
I often had to remind people that, oh no, I'm not the incident commander. I'm your crisis communication leader, because those roles are different. And so, yes, maintaining composure is important. Mock exercises, well, let me back up. You start with tabletops. You typically start with, you got your crisis plan that's not really much more than shelfware and phone numbers and calling trees, unless you systematize it. It needs to become part of organizational DNA. And so you move from crisis plan to tabletop exercises, where you're going to have your first talk through, right, at different locations, depending on the size of your organization, where your operations are, to really understand through a conversation where your potential gaps are. And typically following a tabletop exercise, you get a report from there, and you're supposed to make those updates, make those changes, start to systematize things. Because again, I just want to emphasize that crisis comp plan looks real good in that bright red folder, doesn't it? But it doesn't do you much good if everything's falling apart around you and no one knows what to do because they never read it. They just took the folder and put it on their desk. And then full out mock exercises. Those are the best, in my opinion. Those are the exercises where you go into real world simulation and you act it all out. It's all a role play. That's where you're going to find out who's going to lose their stuff in a real situation, and to replace them. You have to have people on the team that can handle it, that can get through it, that can work 24/7 around the clock or whatever it calls for, that can be available, that can keep their composure and keep their head cool. You have to have people who are multifaceted and can digest more than one thing at a time, who can play air traffic control, if you will, in the midst of those situations, and who can think about it in a segmented fashion to make sure that you've checked all the boxes. But that's where you learn who's going to be capable of doing that. Everyone needs to understand what their role is, because in normal day-to-day, you're not in crisis mode. Your role is going to change in the middle of a crisis, and you need to know what it is. What box do you check on that crisis team until you all can get on the other side of it? Sometimes that's a day or two. Sometimes it's months. Even months after you're done with it, you've got congressional hearings. Sometimes you've got legal stuff you've got to work through. So just understanding the life cycle of a crisis and making sure that you've got those pieces proactively planned for.
I have one other question as we start to kind of get closer to the finish line. With hybrid audiences and hybrid work populations, sometimes in different time zones and spread around the world, things that you're starting to or have already recognized and learned about, okay, this is different, and some things that might be helpful to a CEO who's frustrated. Some CEOs are still frustrated by the fact that the workforce is hybrid. But that's like a whole other piece of it, but it is. Just anything that might be helpful to our frustrated CEO listeners on the hybrid piece.
Yeah, I think, again, some of that goes back to culture. I've talked to communications leaders at different organizations, tech companies that are global. One of my friends, she doesn't work in communication. She's actually a family member. She works for a large pharmaceutical. But everybody's trying to figure this world out, right? Like, so initially we didn't have a choice. I mean, we found even churches, right? Like, who had never had any technological capabilities. It's like, oh, wait, now we can't even have service until we just get this whole infrastructure set up. Well, then it took a while to get people to come back anywhere. Again, church. And I thought that was interesting because I didn't see people at church that I saw at football games and stuff. So I was like, I digress. It kind of started to get back to normal. But I think it all has to do with culture, giving people a reason to need to be in person or want to be in person. Some of that has to do with building camaraderie. I think many people you talk to will tell you their quality of life is better now that they're home. I have had some friends who were completely obstinate about going to work from home, but then by the time their company offered them the opportunity and option to come back in person, they didn't want to. I think we all learned a lot about who we are as individuals, whether you're introverted, extroverted, what it is that helps you feel the care and feeding that you need to be your best version of yourself on a daily basis. So I think that this is an area we're still learning. I'm not quite sure how it may change even in the next 3 to 5 years to come. I know we've got some emerging technology that is going to make that interesting. I actually have a graphic designer friend who sent me a link to Best Buy to purchase Oculus goggles so that we could meet in the metaverse sometime in the next month. And she's describing this to me, and I haven't done it yet, but she is telling me about some clients she has outside of the country, and she feels like she's in the room with them. So I'm excited about it, but I'm not sure what it means about our future. I know for my are my kids, my ex-one, they probably are Z, the 14-year-old. But I mean, the way that they interact or not, right, is so much different than my generation.
Yeah.
I'm a Gen Xer, and I literally sometimes, quite frankly, because I believe in people having social skills, I put them on phone fast, where it's like I literally take their phone and put it in a safe, and it's like, you're not in trouble, but I think that you need a break from the phone for the day. You've been on it all day. We haven't seen you. You've been in your room on the phone.
Yep.
Or I've come into my daughter's room and it's almost like she's praying to the thing, like she's on her knees on it. Like, what are you doing here? And so it will be interesting. I know I've kind of meandered a little bit on a tangent, but the other thing that I wanted to say about that CEOs may want to consider is what that means for them, right? Like how they need to be positioned for how the world is still going to keep changing, because that's what happens. It keeps evolving. We're seeing that with AI right now. I just got today my email from my university on the acceptable use of Chat GPT, because the culture that we're adopting is not that we're going to preclude the use of it, but it does need to be under the supervision of an educator to guide students on how to use it, because it's not going to go away. It's just going to grow.
I love that.
And so the other last thought was from my family member who works at a pharmaceutical. One of the things that they're doing in terms of making sure that they can deliver to their clients is ensuring they have coverage round the clock in every time zone. And so that is also potentially a consideration for CEOs. We're trying to map that out. So figuring out how to have a culture that helps people still feel like they're grown-ups, right? And that you trust them, but just making sure you're covered, making sure the business is covered. There's ways to do that without babysitting people.
That's fantastic.
Yep,
Yeah.
that's good.
Yeah, thank you. That's really good.
All right. What do you think about putting a rounding third and heading home, as I like to say, and moving into the let's get practical?
Yeah, the fun,
We're there.
like the lightning round.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. It's a little bit of a recap, but for our listener, this is the part of the conversation where we like to give you very specific practical things that you can implement in your business to make inroads, to make positive strides in specifically today, the areas that we've been talking about, strategic communication. So Monique, if you're okay with that, we'll put you on the spot. What based on either things we talked about today or things we didn't, that like, oh, we should have talked about that. What 2 or 3 things would you instruct a CEO to do to move the business forward?
Yeah, for sure. I would have that CEO assess their current performance, communication wise and marketing inside their organization, as well as external to the organization. Just getting a good pressure check on what they're doing well, a SWOT, if you will. What are we doing well already? Where are weaknesses? Where are opportunities? Where are our threats? And just thinking about how to turn the dial on that in the direction that they intend to have it turn. That would be the first thing. And I don't know if you saw that I'm a graduate of Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Businesses program, December 2021 graduate. And so even as we went through that 4-month intense program, it was it was an abbreviated version of what you probably learned during an MBA over, 2 years, 2.5, 3 years. But they had us do that with our own small businesses, and they had us conduct a vulnerability assessment, a risk assessment, if you will, so that we could proactively identify situations that we know we're highly likely to run into in a worst case scenario, like list them out, and then create a strategy for what we would do if we ran into those situations. And believe it or not, I'm not going to name an organization, but I may have worked at an organization that required me years and years ago to write a global pandemic communication plan. And I didn't probably think that was something that I needed to spend my time on. But nonetheless, there came a day where we had a global pandemic that impacted not only the globe, but the nation. And it's just funny to me because I remember getting that assignment like, why am I spending time on this? But they taught us that, how to think that way at Goldman Sachs. So the first thing, SWOT analysis on what you're doing well inside, outside in terms of communication already. Second is conducting an assessment on your vulnerabilities. Like if you'd be surprised, if you really sat there and think about what could potentially steamroll us, we can come up with a list of 10 things. I bet you. And then thirdly is if there's not already a crisis communication plan in place, get one. Not just communication, but thinking about, how to move beyond that. Crisis communication, crisis management, they're different. Getting that in place. And if CEOs don't have the budget or capacity to invest in that right now, then I highly recommend that at minimum, they have their issues and crisis messaging ready to go for inside and outside. I mean, that investment is a lot less, but that's what they're going to need if they have to answer to whatever it is that is steamrolling them.
Fantastic.
Yep.
Thank you. Patsy, you want to go first?
Patsy, you want to jump in?
Sure. There was an overall theme of being prepared. So you talked about if you're speaking, prepared for speaking, both in your body and in what you're going to say. So, and in positive self-talk. So that was one area that we were talking about being prepared. There was another that is kind of around the crisis communication, but you said, if you're not prepared, get prepared. So there you are. And if you need a friend, you better have one on hand. So there was definitely a prepared, I would say prepared and practice. So the other thing I'm realizing is it's not just being prepared. You want to be ready to go with what you've just prepared yourself for. So that's
For sure.
what I have.
Good.
All right. Well, these are pretty simple in some ways, but understanding your audience is a must.
Yeah.
And it's a little more complicated than it used to be. So don't just approach it with, the past in mind or a simple mind about it. And this ties to the next one is just do research. Do research before a brand update or anything that might represent change or a new strategy or something crucial to execute on. I love the whole notion of just be open to all of us and what we share in common.
Yeah.
It seems well, I won't say any more about it. I loved it. Thank you. I heard it from you.
Great.
It seems fairly intuitive, Liv, huh?
All right, I'll add just a couple. Patsy already mentioned being prepared, but to get even more specific, Monique, I love when you were talking about dealing with nervousness, addressing nervousness before you are in front of the audience, before you're in front of the board, and that there are specific strategies like breathing, like anticipating the questions, the positive self-talk, really knowing your material. I thought those were very practical things that a CEO can do to help alleviate the nervousness. And you were talking about dealing with your natural nervousness, your natural tendency to be nervous before you find yourself in that situation. I thought that was really practical. I loved when you were saying, it's just a reminder, because I think CEOs forget this, your tenor as a CEO affects everyone and everything. You said that. So convey your frustrations with self-control and in a way that is respectful to the audience. The phrase there was self-regulate, because I don't think people are comfortable often coming by the CEO and saying, hey, tone it down. Like take responsibility. And then the last thing I will say is, gosh, there was a lot. I thought this was a good reminder, right? That understand that when whether it's I hate to say intentionally, but whether it's through ignorance, when you misstep and when you offend a group of people, you're actually offending other people across all cultures who understand the importance of respecting and honoring everybody. And I think that's a good reminder, because our focus goes immediately to the group that we offended. What's the problem? I didn't mean it that way, but it is everybody at this point is looking for that, looking for respect of all. That was poignant and a good reminder. Anything else anybody wants to add? Any other? Patsy.
So you talked about teach, reteach, and remind.
Yeah.
And I think that is an ongoing cyclical, right, mantra, so to speak, that
Yes.
it's a journey and it requires patience.
A lot of patience.
Yes.
Just so you know, Monique, we all take lots of notes. We just try to limit it so that our Let's Get Practical doesn't turn out to be as long as the interview itself.
I know, but she's making it really difficult today.
Yes. So let's make sure that we spotlight you, Monique, Avant Solutions. If a listener is interested in help with that SWOT analysis, or in navigating through a crisis, or actually better yet, preparing for a crisis, not calling you in the middle of one, what's the best way to contact you? And what's the best way for them to reach you?
Sure. They can just go to our website, avantsolutions.org, AVANT solutions.org, as in gold, and they will be able to complete just basic profile information, their name, their email address, and it will ping us to reach out to them to set up a time to discuss their needs.
Excellent. And I don't want to leave without announcing or pre-announcing, you have manuscript coming out. Is that
Yay,
correct?
I'm so excited. Yes. So tomorrow we will launch the pre-sales campaign. It's my first ever manuscript. It's first draft. So pre-sales, first draft. I'm going to spend the next 4 to 5 months cleaning it up with the structural editor. I did it through a company called manuscripts.com. And when I initially spoke to them in December, I'm like, there's no way I have time to do that. And they said, you're never going to have time. Let's just go. And so here we are. It's exciting. A lot of work, a lot of late nights, but we are just trucking along here. So really excited for that announcement. Hashtag chart your path. That's the name of the book. So
Excellent. And can I find that also at the AvantSolutions.org website, or is that someplace else?
it's going to be on its own website. You can find it on, we will have some links to it from our Avant Solutions social media channels. And if you follow me on LinkedIn, you'll certainly see it there.
Excellent. Excellent. Monique, thank you for joining us today.
Yes.
Thank you all. You had some really good questions that made me think. And so I do hope that even if one CEO finds this valuable, it's well worth the time we spent chatting this evening. So I appreciate the invitation.
I'm certain of that. Leb, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you, Monique.
And
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
I learned a
Listener,
lot.
thank you. What's that? I'm sorry.
I said I learned a lot,
Yes.
and it was fun.
Yeah,
What's fun?
it was
Monique,
fun. Yeah.
listener, thank you for sticking with us to the end of another episode of the Frustrated CEO podcast. You can download this episode's Let's Get Practical directly from our website at thefrustratedceo.com, as well as you can find links to contact Monique and Avant Solutions there as well. If you're interested in being on a future episode, contact Leb Tannenbaum or Patsy Feeman or Patrick Lyons. Any one of us, connect with us on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're looking for any support in your business, that is what each of us can help you do as well. I think that's it. With that said, thank you so much. And we'll see you again next time on the Frustrated CEO podcast.